What unsolved medical mysteries continue to terrify researchers? Story 1. Brooke Greenberg lived for 20 years, but her body never seemed to develop beyond early childhood. When she died in 2013, doctors still could not fully explain what had happened to her. At first glance, Brooke appeared to be a toddler. She remained extremely small throughout her life, weighed very little, and never physically matured the way a normal human being should. But what terrified researchers was not simply her appearance. It was the way her entire biology seemed disconnected from normal aging itself. Different parts of her body appeared to age at different rates. Some organs developed more normally, while others remained almost infant-like. Her teeth, bones, and tissues did not match her actual age consistently. Doctors described it as though the body's internal clock had somehow fractured, leaving certain systems frozen in time, while others continued moving forward. And nobody could find a known disorder that explained it. Researchers performed extensive genetic testing, hoping to uncover a mutation or syndrome responsible for Brooke's condition. Nothing definitive ever appeared. Some scientists informally called the phenomenon Syndrome X, not because it was an official diagnosis, but because medicine genuinely lacked an explanation. That uncertainty is what made the case so disturbing. Human aging is still poorly understood. Scientists know what aging looks like, but they still debate why organisms deteriorate over time and whether the process can someday be slowed or altered. Brooke's body suggested there may be hidden biological mechanisms controlling development and aging that science barely understands. For researchers studying longevity, genetics, and cellular decline, her condition hinted at something profound buried deep within human biology. A reminder that even today, medicine still does not fully understand why humans age at all. Story 2. Sirenomelia looks like something from mythology, which is exactly why people started calling it mermaid syndrome. Babies born with sirenomelia have legs that are partially or completely fused together, creating the appearance of a single tail-like lower body. But the condition is far more serious than its nickname suggests. The fusion usually comes with severe internal complications. The kidneys may be missing or malformed. The bladder, intestines, spine, pelvis, and reproductive organs can also develop abnormally. Because kidney development is so critical for producing amniotic fluid before birth, many affected babies also have underdeveloped lungs. That is why sirenomelia is often fatal. What makes it so disturbing medically is how early and dramatically development goes wrong. During pregnancy, the lower body forms through an incredibly precise sequence of cell growth, blood supply, tissue signaling, and organ formation. In sirenomelia, something disrupts that process so severely that the body essentially builds the lower limbs as one fused structure instead of two separate legs. Researchers still debate the exact cause. Some theories involve abnormal blood vessel development, where blood flow to the lower embryo becomes restricted. Others focus on disruptions in early developmental signaling pathways. But no single explanation accounts for every case. And that uncertainty is what makes it terrifying. Human development is usually invisible to us. We only see the final result. Conditions like sirenomelia reveal how fragile the process actually is, how a tiny error during early embryonic formation can reshape the entire body before birth. It's a reminder that the human body is not assembled like a machine. It is grown through millions of delicate biological instructions. And when those instructions misfire, the results can look almost unreal. Story 3. Jill Price terrified and fascinated neuroscientists because her memory seemed to operate almost nothing like a normal human brain. Give her a random date from decades earlier, and she could often tell you exactly what day of the week it was, what the weather was like, what she was doing, what was on television, or even details of conversations from that day. Not approximately, in disturbing detail, researchers eventually identified her condition as highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM. Since Jill Price first came to public attention in the 2000s, other individuals with similar abilities have been identified, including children. What makes HSAM so unsettling is that these people are not simply good at remembering. Most humans forget constantly. Memory is selective and messy. Our brains compress experiences, distort details, and discard enormous amounts of information automatically. But people with HSAM appear able to retrieve autobiographical memories with astonishing accuracy across years or decades. And researchers still don't fully understand how brain scans have shown structural differences in some people with HSAM, particularly in regions associated with memory processing and obsessive thought patterns. But scientists still cannot explain exactly why certain brains preserve autobiographical experiences so intensely, while most people lose them gradually over time. And honestly, the condition is not always a gift. Many people with HSAM describe it as exhausting because painful memories never truly fade. Embarrassment, grief, fear, trauma, arguments, they can replay vividly years later as though they happened recently. That may be the creepiest part. Most humans rely on forgetting to stay psychologically healthy. HSAM suggests the brain's tendency to blur and erase memories might not be a flaw at all, but a survival mechanism. Story 4. Aquagenic urticaria sounds almost impossible when people first hear about it because it appears to make someone allergic to water itself. But for the tiny number of people diagnosed with the condition, contact with water can trigger painful rashes, hives, itching, and burning sensations within minutes. And it doesn't matter whether the water is hot, cold, fresh, salty, clean, or dirty. Rain, sweat, tears, showers, even humidity can become a problem. That's what makes the condition so terrifying medically. Human beings are basically built around water. The body depends on it constantly, so the idea that simple exposure can trigger painful reactions feels almost biologically absurd. Yet, fewer than 100 documented cases worldwide have forced researchers to take it seriously. And the creepiest part is that scientists still don't fully understand what causes it. Technically, people are probably not allergic to water molecules themselves, because that would be incompatible with life. Instead, researchers suspect the water may interact with substances in the skin, oils, proteins, chemicals, or immune compounds, triggering a reaction that produces hives and inflammation. But no single explanation fits every case. That uncertainty has made treatment extremely difficult. Some patients respond partially to antihistamines, barrier creams, or specialized bathing methods, while others continue suffering severe reactions despite extensive medical care. And honestly, the psychological toll sounds awful, too. Imagine having to think carefully before sweating, exercising, showering, walking in rain, or even crying. Most people never notice how often water touches their skin throughout the day. Aquagenic urticaria forces patients to become hyper-aware of something the rest of humanity experiences constantly without thought. It's one of those conditions that reminds researchers how many basic functions of the human body are still not fully understood, even something as fundamental as how skin reacts to water. Story 5. Stiff person syndrome is one of the most frightening neurological disorders researchers study, because it can slowly trap people inside bodies that begin locking themselves into constant tension and pain. At first, symptoms can seem deceptively mild. Muscle stiffness, spasms, difficulty walking, sudden jerking movements. But as the condition progresses, the body can become rigid almost continuously. And the spasms can be horrifyingly violent. Some episodes are triggered by ordinary things like loud sounds, emotional stress, physical contact, or sudden movement. In severe cases, the muscle contractions become so intense they can dislocate joints or even fracture bones. That's what makes the disorder so terrifying medically. The body's normal braking system for muscle control appears to malfunction. Under ordinary circumstances, the brain and spinal cord constantly regulate and suppress excessive muscle activation. In people with stiff person syndrome, that inhibition decreases dramatically, allowing muscles to fire uncontrollably. Researchers now believe the disorder is strongly linked to autoimmunity. In many patients, the immune system appears to mistakenly attack proteins involved in regulating nerve signaling, particularly pathways associated with the neurotransmitter GABA, one of the brain's primary calming chemical systems. Without proper inhibitory signaling, the nervous system can become hyperexcitable almost constantly. But scientists still do not fully understand why it happens, why severity varies so dramatically, or why some patients deteriorate much faster than others. And honestly, one of the creepiest aspects is how trapped patients can become inside their own awareness. The mind remains intact, while the body gradually becomes increasingly rigid, hypersensitive, and difficult to control. Some patients eventually struggle to walk, speak normally, or move without triggering agonizing spasms. It's a reminder of how delicate the nervous system really is. A tiny disruption in the brain's balance between excitation and inhibition can transform ordinary movement into something painful and uncontrollable. Story 6. Mal de débarquement syndrome begins with a feeling most people recognize. You step off a boat after hours at sea and still feel like the ground is moving beneath you. Your body sways slightly, almost as if the motion continues even though you're standing still. Normally, the brain recalibrates within minutes or hours. But for people with disembarkment syndrome, that sensation never fully stops. Days, months, sometimes even years later, they still feel as though they are rocking, swaying, or floating constantly. And the strangest part is that the symptoms often improve while riding in a moving vehicle again, only to return once motion stops. That detail alone deeply confuses researchers. The disorder appears connected to the brain's balance and motion processing systems, particularly how the brain adapts to repetitive movement. Normally, the nervous system adjusts itself to environments like ships, airplanes, trains, or long car rides. But in mal de débarquement syndrome, scientists think the brain may become stuck in that adaptive state, as though the nervous system never fully realizes the motion ended. What makes the condition so frightening is how invisible it is. Patients can appear completely normal while feeling constant movement internally every second of the day. Many describe it as living permanently on a gently rocking boat. The exhaustion, dizziness, disorientation, anxiety, and sleep disruption can become overwhelming. And researchers still do not fully understand why certain people develop it while most never do. Women between 30 and 60 appear more susceptible, and this may be linked to migraines, hormones, or abnormal sensory processing. But no single explanation fully accounts for the disorder. That uncertainty makes treatment difficult. For some people, the symptoms gradually fade. For others, the sensation can linger for years, turning ordinary stillness into something the brain itself can no longer properly recognize. Story 7. Morgellons disease is one of the most divisive and disturbing medical mysteries, because even researchers still argue over whether it is primarily a physical illness, a psychiatric condition, or some combination of both. People who report morgellons describe terrifying symptoms. They develop sores or lesions on the skin accompanied by sensations of crawling, stinging, biting, or movement beneath the surface of the body. Many patients also report strange fibers or thread-like materials emerging from the wounds. And for the people experiencing it, the condition feels completely real and physically overwhelming. That's where the controversy begins. Some doctors believe morgellons is closely related to delusional parasitosis, a psychiatric condition where individuals become convinced something is infesting or attacking their body despite lack of evidence. In those cases, treatments involving therapy, antidepressants, or antipsychotic medications sometimes help reduce symptoms. But not all researchers are satisfied with that explanation. Some studies have examined the mysterious fibers directly and proposed that at least some cases may involve abnormal skin protein production, environmental contamination, or infectious triggers. There have even been theories connecting the condition to bacterial infections such as Lyme disease or other immune-related abnormalities. The problem is that no single explanation fits every reported case. And that uncertainty is what makes morgellons so unsettling medically. Patients often feel dismissed by the healthcare system, while physicians struggle with symptoms that do not fit neatly into established diagnostic categories. The condition sits uncomfortably at the intersection of dermatology, neurology, psychiatry, and immunology. Researchers still do not fully understand why some people experience these symptoms, why the sensations feel so convincing, or why the condition can become so psychologically consuming. It's a reminder that even modern medicine still encounters disorders where the line between mind, body, and perception becomes frighteningly unclear. Story 8. Landon Jones became the center of a baffling medical mystery after something inside his body appeared to simply switch off. In 2013, Landon reportedly went to bed as a healthy 12-year-old boy and woke up the next morning with no appetite and no sense of thirst. Not reducing hunger, not nausea. The physical drive to eat and drink seemed to disappear almost entirely, and it never properly returned. Over the following year, his weight dropped dramatically from around 104 pounds to roughly 68. Doctors performed brain scans, psychiatric evaluations, digestive testing, and screenings for eating disorders, but nothing clearly explained what was happening. That's what made the case so frightening. Hunger and thirst are among the most fundamental survival mechanisms in human biology. They are deeply hardwired into the brain. Normally, if a person stops eating or drinking, overwhelming biological signals force them to seek food and water eventually. But in Landon's case, those signals appeared severely disrupted. Some physicians suspected dysfunction involving the hypothalamus, a region of the brain responsible for regulating hunger, thirst, temperature, hormones, and survival drives. Even small abnormalities there can produce catastrophic effects on the body. But no definitive diagnosis was ever publicly confirmed. And honestly, that uncertainty is what unsettled researchers most. The case suggested that something capable of controlling basic human survival instincts could malfunction silently, without obvious structural damage appearing on scans. A tiny disruption somewhere in the brain's signaling systems may have effectively disabled drives every human depends on to stay alive. It's deeply eerie to realize how much of human survival relies on invisible neurological systems operating constantly in the background, and how fragile those systems may actually be. Story 9. A man in Colombia became the center of one of the strangest medical cases ever documented after doctors discovered that the tumors growing throughout his body were not entirely human. The patient, who had advanced HIV or AIDS and a severely weakened immune system, arrived at the hospital with lesions in his lungs and lymph nodes that initially looked like aggressive cancer. But when pathologists examined the cells under a microscope, something felt deeply wrong. The tumors were tiny, far smaller than normal human cancer cells. Researchers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention were eventually brought in to investigate. Genetic testing revealed an almost unbelievable explanation. The abnormal cells contained DNA from tapeworms. More specifically, the patient was infected with a tapeworm species called Hymenelepis nana, and the parasite itself had apparently developed cancer. Somehow, those malignant tapeworm cells spread through the man's body and continued growing inside him. That's what made the case horrifying to researchers. Cancer is usually thought of as a disease confined to an individual organism's own cells. But in this case, a parasite's cancerous cells effectively invaded another species entirely. Because the patient's immune system was devastated by AIDS, his body could not properly destroy the foreign malignant cells. The man died before doctors could attempt any meaningful treatment. And honestly, the case terrified scientists because it revealed something nobody had seriously considered before. Under rare conditions, cancer itself may be capable of behaving almost like an infectious organism crossing between species boundaries. It completely blurred the line between cancer, parasite, and infection in a way medicine had never really seen before. Story 10. That's honestly one of the creepiest things about mal de débarquement syndrome. A lot of people who experience it genuinely think they're losing their mind at first, because the symptoms sound so bizarre when you try to explain them. You know you're standing still, but your brain keeps insisting the floor is moving. People describe it like permanently being on a boat. Rocking, swaying, bobbing, floating sensations that just refuse to stop long after the motion itself ended. And because the condition was barely known publicly for years, many patients got dismissed as anxious, stressed, or psychosomatic before doctors started recognizing it more seriously. The weirdest part is how specific the triggers are. Cruises are the classic example, but planes, trains, long car rides, elevators, even repetitive motion environments can trigger it. Then, for some reason, symptoms often improve during motion again, like while driving, only to return once the movement stops. That detail really freaked researchers out because it suggests the brain's motion adaptation systems are somehow getting stuck in the wrong mode, almost like the nervous system recalibrates for movement but never fully resets afterward. And honestly, the fact that you experienced it in the 90s before most people had even heard the name probably made it even more isolating. Back then, there was far less awareness, fewer studies, and not much public information about vestibular disorders in general. It's one of those conditions that really exposes how dependent our sense of reality is on tiny, invisible systems in the brain, constantly interpreting balance, motion, and spatial orientation correctly. One subtle glitch, and the brain can make stillness itself feel wrong. Story 11. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is one of those historical events that sounds completely fictional until you realize multiple contemporary accounts describe it happening in terrifying detail. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman reportedly began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Not celebrating, not performing, just dancing frantically for hours without stopping. Then other people joined her. Within days, dozens were dancing. Eventually, the number supposedly climbed into the hundreds. Witnesses described people convulsing, screaming, collapsing from exhaustion, then getting back up and continuing again almost involuntarily. And this went on for weeks. Some reportedly died from strokes, heart attacks, dehydration, or sheer physical exhaustion. The truly surreal part is that local authorities initially believed the victims needed to dance the sickness out. So instead of stopping them, they actually hired musicians and opened halls to encourage the dancing. which obviously made things worse. Researchers still argue over what caused it. One theory involves mass psychogenic illness, essentially a form of extreme collective psychological contagion triggered by stress, fear, famine, disease, and religious anxiety during an incredibly brutal period of European history. Another famous theory involves ergot fungus contaminating grain supplies. Ergot contains compounds chemically related to LSD and can produce hallucinations, convulsions, and bizarre neurological symptoms. But neither explanation fully accounts for everything. That uncertainty is what keeps the event so unsettling. The idea that entire crowds of people could suddenly lose control of their own bodies and dance themselves toward death feels less like history and more like some kind of collective nightmare humanity still cannot fully explain. Story 12. The mystery surrounding Havana syndrome genuinely unsettled intelligence agencies and medical researchers because the symptoms sounded almost like something out of science fiction. Beginning around 2016, American and Canadian embassy personnel stationed in Havana started reporting bizarre experiences. Some described hearing intense high-pitched sounds, buzzing, or piercing directional noises shortly before suddenly developing symptoms associated with brain injury. Others described pressure sensations so strange they compared them to walking into an invisible beam or force field. Then came the neurological problems. Victims reported headaches, dizziness, nausea, balance problems, insomnia, memory issues, concentration difficulties, tinnitus, and emotional disturbances. Some said symptoms worsened dramatically while using computers or trying to focus cognitively for long periods. And what frightened doctors most was that several individuals appeared to show genuine neurological abnormalities afterward. Brain imaging studies in some cases reportedly suggested changes involving balance systems, white matter pathways, or regions associated with auditory and cognitive processing. Though researchers continue debating how definitive those findings actually are. That uncertainty is what turned the entire situation into a global controversy. Some experts believe the symptoms may have resulted from directed microwave or radio frequency energy exposure, potentially tied to surveillance or experimental technology. Others argue the cases may represent a form of mass psychogenic illness amplified by stress, fear, and geopolitical tension. And honestly, neither explanation feels comforting. If it was psychological, it demonstrated how powerful collective neurological stress responses can become under extreme conditions. If it involved some unknown directed energy mechanism, then it suggested governments may possess technologies capable of affecting the human nervous system in ways the public barely understands. Years later, researchers still do not fully agree on what actually happened, which is exactly why the case continues to disturb people so much. Story 13. Mitsutaka Uchikoshi became the center of one of the strangest survival cases modern medicine has ever seen, because by all normal biological expectations, he should not have survived. In 2006, Uchikoshi disappeared while hiking on Mount Roko in Japan. He reportedly slipped, suffered injuries, and lost consciousness in a remote area of the mountain. Then he vanished for 24 days. No food, almost no water, exposed to cold outdoor conditions the entire time. When rescuers finally found him, they expected a body. Instead, he was somehow still alive. What stunned doctors was his physical state. His body temperature had dropped dramatically. His metabolism appeared severely slowed, and he had entered something resembling suspended animation or hibernation. Physicians compared aspects of the condition to hypothermia, induced metabolic suppression, where the body drastically reduces energy consumption to preserve vital organs, and somehow, it worked long enough to keep him alive. Normally, humans can survive only a limited number of days without water under ordinary conditions. But extreme cold can alter those limits by slowing the body's processes dramatically. In Uchikoshi's case, researchers think the low temperatures and unconscious state may have reduced his metabolic needs enough to prevent fatal dehydration and starvation for far longer than should have been possible. That's what made the case so eerie medically. Human beings are not supposed to hibernate. Yet under rare conditions, the body may possess emergency survival mechanisms capable of slowing metabolism far beyond what scientists fully understand. Cases like Uchikoshi's forced researchers to reconsider just how adaptable the human body might become under extreme environmental stress. It's deeply unsettling to realize that somewhere inside human biology are dormant survival responses that modern medicine still barely understands. Story 14. The outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in 1976 absolutely terrified public health officials because from the outside it genuinely looked like a mysterious new killer disease appearing out of nowhere. It happened during an American Legion convention at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Hundreds of attendees, mostly older men and military veterans, suddenly started developing severe pneumonia-like symptoms. Fever, coughing, chest pain, breathing difficulty, exhaustion. Then people started dying. At first, nobody knew what they were dealing with. Investigators considered everything from swine flu to chemical poisoning to deliberate biological attack because the outbreak seemed so sudden and localized. And the really creepy part was that doctors couldn't initially identify the organism causing it at all. Months later, researchers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention finally isolated a previously unknown bacterium from infected lung tissue, Legionella pneumophila. That discovery changed the entire understanding of the outbreak. The bacteria weren't brand new at all. They had likely existed in nature for a very long time. The problem was that modern building systems, especially cooling towers, air conditioning systems, plumbing, and warm water environments, created ideal conditions for the bacteria to grow and spread through tiny aerosolized water droplets. People literally inhaled contaminated mist without realizing it. And honestly, that realization was deeply unsettling in its own way. The danger wasn't some exotic jungle virus or laboratory accident. It was ordinary infrastructure: hotels, hospitals, office buildings, cruise ships, fountains, cooling systems, places people interacted with every day. The outbreak exposed how modern technology can accidentally create entirely new disease environments that humanity never evolved to deal with before. Story 15. Encephalitis lethargica is one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in modern history because it appeared suddenly, devastated thousands of people, and then almost vanished without anyone fully understanding what caused it. The disease emerged around the same time as the Spanish flu pandemic, which immediately led researchers to suspect some kind of connection. But even now, scientists still debate whether encephalitis lethargica was triggered by influenza, an autoimmune reaction, another infectious agent, or something else entirely. And the symptoms were horrifying. Victims often developed fever, headaches, eye problems, and overwhelming fatigue before slipping into bizarre neurological states. Some became almost completely motionless and unresponsive, trapped in rigid bodies while still partially aware of the world around them. That's why the disease became known as sleeping sickness, though it wasn't the same as African sleeping sickness caused by parasites. Some patients slept for incredibly long periods. Others entered catatonic states, frozen almost statue-like. Survivors sometimes developed severe Parkinsonian symptoms years later, losing the ability to move normally, speak fluidly, or control their own bodies. The most haunting cases were later described by neurologist Oliver Sacks in Awakenings. Many patients spent decades trapped in near-motionless states before briefly waking up after treatment with L-Dopa in the 1960s. And honestly, that's the part that still terrifies researchers. The disease seemed capable of selectively altering consciousness, movement, personality, and awareness in ways medicine still does not fully understand. Then after devastating thousands of people worldwide, the major epidemic faded away almost as mysteriously as it appeared, which raises the deeply unsettling possibility that whatever caused it may still exist somewhere, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. Story 16. Terrare sounded so unbelievable that for years many people assumed his story had to be exaggerated folklore. But multiple physicians documented his condition during the late 1700s, and honestly, the details are horrifying. Terrare was born in France and reportedly suffered from an appetite so extreme it seemed almost biologically impossible. As a teenager, he could allegedly consume enormous amounts of food without ever feeling satisfied. His parents eventually threw him out because they literally could not afford to feed him anymore, and things only got stranger from there. While serving with the French Revolutionary Army, Terrare constantly scavenged for food because military rations barely affected his hunger at all. Witnesses described him eating garbage, animal remains, and scraps from gutters and refuse piles just to survive. Doctors became fascinated after he was hospitalized from exhaustion and starvation, despite eating absurd amounts of food. Medical experiments followed. Physicians reportedly watched him consume meals intended for over a dozen people in one sitting. He swallowed live animals whole: cats, snakes, puppies, lizards, eels, often without chewing. Accounts describe him tearing into raw meat with almost animalistic desperation. And somehow, despite all this, he remained relatively thin. That's what disturbed doctors most. His body produced enormous heat and sweat. His stomach supposedly expanded dramatically after eating, and he emitted an overpowering odor described as putrid. Yet physicians of the era could never explain what underlying condition caused his endless hunger. Some modern theories suggest hyperthyroidism, hypothalamic damage, severe metabolic disorders, or rare neurological dysfunctions affecting satiety. But nobody knows for certain. And honestly, the creepiest part is realizing that something inside his brain or metabolism may have completely disabled one of humanity's most basic biological limits: the ability to ever feel full. Story 17. Charles Fort was basically the patron saint of weird, unexplained phenomena long before the internet existed. The guy spent years buried in libraries, combing through newspapers, scientific journals, eyewitness reports, and obscure publications, collecting stories that mainstream science either ignored or couldn't explain cleanly, which is why his books like Lo and The Book of the Damned feel so strangely modern. Reading them honestly feels a little like scrolling through old internet mystery forums, except assembled from 19th and early 20th century newspaper archives. And yeah, spontaneous human combustion was one of the topics that obsessed him. The stories are genuinely unsettling. People allegedly found it reduced almost entirely to ash, while nearby furniture remained mostly untouched. In some cases, parts of the body were destroyed so completely that investigators struggled to understand how ordinary fire could have generated enough heat. That contradiction is what made the cases so infamous. Normally, cremating a body completely takes sustained high temperatures for hours. Yet some spontaneous combustion reports described rooms with minimal fire damage despite victims being catastrophically burned. Modern investigators generally lean toward explanations like the wick effect, where body fat acts almost like candle wax once clothing ignites, allowing a body to burn slowly and intensely while surrounding objects remain relatively spared. But honestly, even the wick effect sounds disturbing when you read the details. And Fort loved exactly that kind of thing. Cases balanced awkwardly between plausible explanation and lingering unease. That's really why his work stayed influential. He wasn't necessarily trying to prove the supernatural. He was cataloging all the strange little corners where reality seemed less stable and less understood than people wanted to admit. Story 18, hemolacria, is one of those medical phenomena that sounds like something invented for horror fiction. which is exactly why cases without a clear explanation disturb both patients and doctors so much. People with hemolacria literally appear to cry blood. In many cases, researchers can identify a cause: eye injuries, infection, tumors, blood vessel abnormalities, hormonal changes, clotting disorders, severe inflammation, or trauma can all allow blood to mix with tears. Sometimes the bleeding originates from the tear ducts, conjunctiva, or nearby tissues. But then there are the cases where doctors find nothing definitive at all. That's what makes the condition so unsettling. Some patients suddenly begin producing bloody tears intermittently without obvious injury or disease. Episodes may last minutes or recur unpredictably over months or years. And because the symptom is so visually shocking, many sufferers become terrified long before physicians even begin investigating. Honestly, it's easy to understand why. Seeing blood emerge from your eyes taps into something deeply primal. Even when the condition itself is not immediately life-threatening, it looks profoundly wrong in a way that instinctively alarms people. Researchers suspect that some unexplained cases may involve microscopic vascular abnormalities, stress-related physiological changes, hormonal fluctuations, or rare inflammatory conditions too subtle for current diagnostic methods to detect easily. But there's still a frustrating amount medicine does not fully understand. And the really eerie part is how fragile the human body's tiny systems can be. The eye contains an incredibly dense network of microscopic blood vessels, ducts, membranes, and pressure systems operating constantly without us noticing. Sometimes a tiny disturbance in those systems can produce symptoms so bizarre they feel almost supernatural despite having a biological origin. That tension between terrifying appearance and incomplete medical understanding is exactly why unexplained hemolacria cases continue to fascinate researchers. Story 19, you're talking about Gloria Ramirez, the so-called Toxic Lady case from 1994, which is still one of the strangest incidents in modern medical history. Ramirez arrived at a California emergency room critically ill with advanced cancer symptoms. But what terrified hospital staff was what happened afterward. Multiple doctors and nurses suddenly began experiencing dizziness, nausea, fainting, breathing problems, and burning sensations while treating her. Some staff members collapsed entirely. Witnesses reported strange odors, including fruity or garlic-like smells, and some claimed to see unusual oily or crystalline substances on her skin or in her blood samples. The entire emergency department basically descended into panic because people genuinely thought they were being poisoned by proximity alone. The leading explanation eventually involved dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO. DMSO was sometimes used as a topical home remedy for pain, and it can absolutely produce garlic-like breath odors after absorption because of how the body metabolizes sulfur compounds. Investigators theorize that Gloria may have been heavily using DMSO ointment for pain relief. Under the unusual conditions of the emergency room, oxygen administration, electrical defibrillation, blood chemistry changes, and hospital medications, some researchers proposed the DMSO may have chemically transformed into more toxic sulfur compounds, potentially creating airborne irritants that sicken staff. But the explanation remains controversial. Critics argue the chemistry may not fully account for the severity of symptoms reported, while others think mass psychogenic reactions amplified the event after the first few people became ill. And honestly, that uncertainty is what keeps the case so creepy. The idea that an ordinary hospital room could suddenly become a chemically dangerous environment from interactions nobody fully anticipated still deeply unsettles people in medicine. Story 20, a 25-year-old man in Munich became the subject of a bizarre neurological study after doctors discovered that his seizures were triggered almost specifically by solving Sudoku puzzles. Not stress in general, not numbers alone, not reading or writing, Sudoku itself. Researchers found that the man could read normally, perform mathematical calculations, and even write numbers without major problems. But when he attempted certain visuospatial tasks involving numerical organization, especially Sudoku-style pattern processing, his brain activity could suddenly shift into seizure states. That's what made the case so fascinating to neurologists. The condition appears related to a phenomenon called reflex epilepsy, where seizures are triggered by very specific stimuli or mental activities. Some people experience seizures from flashing lights, music, reading, hot water, or even particular sounds. But puzzle-induced seizures are extraordinarily rare. In this patient's case, doctors suspected that the unique combination of spatial reasoning, concentration, pattern recognition, and number arrangement required by Sudoku activated vulnerable neural circuits in the brain. Essentially, a very precise type of thinking overloaded specific regions involved in visuospatial processing. And honestly, that's the unsettling part. Most people think of thoughts as abstract and harmless, but cases like this reveal that certain mental activities can physically alter electrical behavior inside the brain strongly enough to trigger dangerous neurological events. The human brain is basically a giant electrochemical network operating on incredibly delicate balances of excitation and inhibition. Usually those systems work invisibly and flawlessly, but occasionally a very specific pattern of cognition can hit exactly the wrong circuitry in exactly the wrong way, which means, for this man, a simple logic puzzle could literally become medically dangerous. Story 21. Gloria Ramirez became the center of one of the strangest hospital incidents ever recorded after medical staff treating her suddenly began collapsing around her. In February 1994, Ramirez arrived at a hospital in California suffering from late-stage cervical cancer complications. At first, the situation seemed like a routine emergency case. Then doctors and nurses started noticing bizarre details. Some reported a strange garlic or ammonia-like odor coming from her body. Others claimed to see oily substances on her skin or unusual crystals in blood samples. Moments later, emergency room staff began feeling dizzy, nauseated, lightheaded, and short of breath. Then people started fainting. Within hours, dozens of hospital workers reported symptoms severe enough that several required hospitalization themselves. Parts of the emergency department were evacuated because staff genuinely feared exposure to some unknown toxic substance, and nobody could immediately explain what had happened. For years, one theory argued the entire event was a form of mass psychogenic illness, where stress and panic spread symptoms through the staff psychologically after the first few workers became ill. But another explanation eventually gained more attention. Researchers proposed that Ramirez may have been using dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, as a home pain treatment. Under unusual emergency room conditions involving oxygen, electrical defibrillation, and other chemical interactions, investigators theorized the DMSO could have transformed into toxic sulfur compounds that affected nearby personnel. The chemistry remains debated, but many experts consider it the most plausible explanation so far. Still, the case continues to unsettle people because of how surreal it sounds. A crowded hospital room. Experienced medical professionals are suddenly collapsing. Strange odors, mysterious reactions, and no definitive answer everyone agrees on decades later. It feels less like ordinary medicine and more like something from a medical horror film that accidentally happened in real life. Story 22. Encephalitis lethargica spread across the world between roughly 1915 and the late 1920s and left millions of people trapped inside bodies that barely moved. Doctors called it sleeping sickness, though it was unrelated to the African parasitic disease with the same nickname. The illness attacked the brain and nervous system in terrifyingly unpredictable ways. Some victims became overwhelmingly drowsy, sleeping for days at a time. Others developed psychosis, hallucinations, paralysis, or bizarre behavioral changes. But the most haunting cases involved patients who entered frozen, statue-like states where they could barely move or speak at all. They remained conscious, but trapped. Many patients appeared almost zombified, staring blankly for hours while barely responding to the world around them. Survivors often later developed severe Parkinsonian symptoms, rigidity, tremors, slowed movement, and loss of facial expression, as if the disease had permanently damaged the brain regions controlling motion. And then, almost as mysteriously as it appeared, the epidemic faded away. That's what still terrifies researchers. Millions were infected worldwide. Hundreds of thousands likely died. Yet medicine still cannot fully explain what caused it. Some scientists suspect a connection to the Spanish flu pandemic because the timing overlaps closely. Others think it may have been an autoimmune reaction, a post-viral neurological syndrome, or an entirely separate infectious agent. But no definitive cause has ever been proven. The disease became even more haunting decades later when neurologist Oliver Sacks treated surviving patients described in Awakenings. Some had spent decades nearly motionless before temporarily regaining awareness and movement through experimental treatment. Imagine losing 30 or 40 years of your life while effectively frozen inside your own body. That possibility is exactly why encephalitis lethargica still deeply unsettles neurologists today. Story 23. Julie Redfern from Lancashire developed one of the strangest sensory conditions doctors had ever encountered after a rare disorder essentially turned her own body into an internal amplifier. She could literally hear her eyes move, not metaphorically, not imagining it. Every glance produced grinding, scraping, or rustling sounds inside her head, loud enough to interfere with daily life. Even blinking or shifting her gaze became distracting because the noises seemed amplified directly inside her skull. And the cause turned out to be genuinely bizarre. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with superior canal dehiscence syndrome, a condition where part of the bone covering the inner ear becomes dangerously thin, or develops an opening. That tiny defect changes how vibrations travel through the skull and auditory system. Normally, many internal bodily sounds are filtered out automatically by the brain and blocked structurally by bone. But with superior canal dehiscence syndrome, patients can begin hearing things human beings were never supposed to perceive consciously. Eye movements, footsteps, jaw motion, blood flow, even their own heartbeat or eyeballs rotating inside the sockets. Some patients describe it as living with a microphone embedded inside their body, and honestly, that's what makes the condition so disturbing. It reveals how much sensory information the brain normally suppresses every second just to make reality tolerable. Your body is constantly producing tiny sounds and vibrations, but under ordinary circumstances, your nervous system filters most of it away. When that filtering system breaks down, the human body suddenly becomes an unnervingly loud place to exist inside. Story 24. Landon Jones from Cedar Falls became the center of a baffling medical mystery after his body suddenly seemed to lose one of humanity's most basic survival instincts. In 2013, Landon reportedly went to sleep as a healthy 12-year-old boy and woke up the next morning with no appetite and no sensation of thirst whatsoever. The feeling simply vanished. Over the following months, his condition became alarming. He rapidly lost weight, dropping from around 104 pounds to roughly 68. Doctors ran brain scans, digestive testing, psychiatric evaluations, and screenings for eating disorders, but nothing clearly explained why his body no longer seemed to demand food or water. That's what frightened researchers so much. Hunger and thirst are among the most deeply hardwired biological drives humans possess. They are controlled by ancient survival systems in the brain designed to keep people alive automatically. Normally, even if someone ignores hunger temporarily, overwhelming signals eventually force them to eat and drink. But in Landon's case, those signals appeared almost completely disrupted. Some doctors suspected damage or dysfunction involving the hypothalamus, a tiny but critically important area of the brain responsible for regulating appetite, thirst, body temperature, hormones, and survival behaviors. Yet scans revealed no obvious catastrophic injury. And years later, no definitive public diagnosis has ever fully explained what happened. That uncertainty is what makes the case so unsettling medically. Somewhere inside the human brain are invisible systems constantly telling us when to eat, drink, sleep, and survive. In Landon Jones's case, one of those systems appeared to simply switch off overnight for reasons doctors still do not fully understand. Story 25. Desiree Jennings from near Tampa became the focus of intense medical controversy after suddenly developing bizarre paralysis-like symptoms that doctors struggled to explain clearly. In 2009, Jennings reportedly received a seasonal flu vaccination and soon afterward began experiencing severe neurological problems. She developed tremors, difficulty speaking, muscle spasms, and an unusual movement disorder that dramatically affected the way she walked. The strangest symptom was how inconsistent the paralysis appeared. Videos showed her struggling to walk forward normally, twisting and jerking with apparent loss of control. But in some clips, she could move backward much more easily than forward, something that deeply confused both observers and physicians. The case exploded online because nobody seemed to agree on what was actually happening. Some believed she had developed a rare neurological reaction connected to the vaccine. Others argued the symptoms were more consistent with a functional neurological disorder, where genuine physical symptoms emerge from disruptions in how the brain processes movement and control, rather than obvious injury to nerves or muscles. And that distinction became extremely controversial, because functional neurological disorders are real and debilitating. They exist in an uncomfortable gray area between neurology and psychology that medicine still does not fully understand. Brain scans may appear normal even while patients experience severe tremors, paralysis, speech problems, or movement abnormalities. That uncertainty made Jennings's case deeply polarizing. To some people, it looked like evidence of a hidden medical reaction. To others, it demonstrated how powerfully the brain itself can alter bodily movement without structural disease. Either way, the case unsettled researchers because it highlighted how incomplete our understanding of the nervous system still is, especially when it comes to the fragile boundary between mind, movement, and physical control. Story 26. Sadia Saleh Al-Jaharani became the focus of worldwide attention after reports emerged claiming the 8-year-old girl from Yemen was somehow producing tiny stone-like objects from her eyes. According to her father, Mohammed Saleh Al-Jaharani, the phenomenon began suddenly when Sadia started crying what appeared to be small, hard pebbles instead of ordinary tears. The story spread rapidly online because of how physically impossible it sounded. Photographs and videos circulated showing tiny stone-like pieces supposedly emerging from the child's eyes without causing the kind of severe damage doctors would normally expect. Witnesses claimed the objects varied in shape and size, while local reports described the family becoming frightened and overwhelmed by the attention. And naturally, skepticism appeared almost immediately. Medical experts pointed out that the human tear ducts and eye structures are extremely delicate. True mineral stones forming and exiting through the eyes repeatedly without catastrophic injury would be extraordinarily unlikely biologically. Some researchers suspected exaggeration, misinterpretation, externally introduced objects, or an undiscovered medical explanation involving calcified debris or hardened secretions. Others questioned whether the reports had been sensationalized heavily through media coverage, but no widely accepted scientific explanation ever fully emerged publicly. That uncertainty is exactly why stories like this spread so intensely. The human eye feels deeply vulnerable and emotionally symbolic already. So claims involving impossible objects emerging from tears immediately trigger a strong reaction because they violate basic expectations about how the body should function. Whether the case involved misunderstanding, hoax, rare pathology, or media distortion, it became another example of how unexplained medical stories can blur the line between biology, folklore, and modern internet mythology. Story 27. In 2011, a group of teenage girls from Leroy became the center of a deeply unsettling medical mystery after suddenly developing strange neurological symptoms that spread through their high school almost like an infection. It reportedly began with Thera Sanchez, who woke from a nap experiencing uncontrollable verbal outbursts, twitching, jerking movements, and violent motor tics that resembled Tourette syndrome. Then other girls at the school began developing similar symptoms. Within months, around a dozen students were experiencing twitching, spasms, vocalizations, shaking episodes, and involuntary movements severe enough to attract national media attention. Parents feared environmental poisoning, infection, contamination, or some undiscovered neurological disease spreading through the community. And honestly, the timing made it feel terrifyingly real, because the symptoms were real. The girls were not pretending. Many underwent extensive neurological testing, toxicology screening, brain scans, and infectious disease investigations. But doctors failed to identify any toxin, virus, structural brain damage, or environmental cause that could fully explain the outbreak. Eventually, many specialists concluded the cases were most consistent with mass psychogenic illness, or functional neurological disorder. That explanation angered many families because people often misunderstand psychogenic illness as fake, but the symptoms themselves can be profoundly real and physically debilitating even without structural disease. And that's what makes cases like Leroy so disturbing medically. They reveal how social stress, fear, emotional pressure, and neurological vulnerability can sometimes spread through groups in ways that mimic infectious disease itself. The human brain is so interconnected with emotion and environment that under certain conditions, entire communities can begin manifesting remarkably similar physical symptoms without a conventional pathogen ever being involved. Story 28, Lisa Reed from Auckland, became the subject of intense medical curiosity after suddenly regaining vision years after doctors believed her blindness was permanent. Reed had reportedly lost much of her sight after suffering a traumatic head injury. For years, she lived with severe visual impairment and was considered legally blind. Then something bizarre happened after another accident. Following a separate injury in 2000, she suddenly began to see again. The change reportedly occurred after she accidentally hit her head while moving furniture. Soon afterward, parts of her vision unexpectedly returned, despite doctors previously believing the damage was irreversible. That's what made the case so unsettling to neurologists. The human visual system is incredibly complex. Sight is not just about the eyes themselves, it depends on massive networks inside the brain processing signals correctly. In some rare cases, traumatic brain injuries can disrupt those networks without completely destroying them. Researchers suspect Reed may have suffered from a form of neurological visual impairment, where the brain's processing pathways became functionally disrupted rather than permanently damaged. The second injury may somehow have altered neural activity enough to partially restore those pathways, but doctors still struggle to explain exactly how something like that happens. And honestly, cases like this deeply disturb assumptions about the brain. Most people imagine brain damage as permanent and straightforward, but neurology often behaves far more strangely. Patients have occasionally regained lost abilities unexpectedly: speech, movement, memory, even vision, sometimes after years of dysfunction. It suggests the brain may possess hidden capacities for rewiring and recovery that science still only partially understands, which means somewhere inside the nervous system, damaged pathways can sometimes remain dormant instead of fully destroyed, waiting for reasons researchers still cannot completely explain. Story 29. Isaiah Acosta from near Ottawa became known internationally because of a condition so rare and severe that doctors were stunned he survived infancy at all. Isaiah was born with agnathia otocephaly complex, an extremely uncommon developmental disorder that can prevent the lower jaw from forming properly during pregnancy. In his case, he was born without a functional lower jaw. That meant he could not open his mouth normally, eat conventionally, or speak the way most people do. From birth, his survival depended on extensive medical intervention, including feeding tubes, surgeries, and specialized airway support. What makes the disorder so medically terrifying is how early the developmental failure occurs. During embryonic growth, the structures forming the face, jaw, ears, and airway emerge through an incredibly delicate sequence of genetic instructions. Even a tiny disruption in those signaling pathways can radically alter how the entire lower face develops, and researchers still do not fully understand why these disruptions happen in many cases. Agnathia otocephaly is so rare that only a small number of cases have ever been documented worldwide. Many infants born with the condition do not survive because the abnormalities can severely affect breathing and feeding immediately after birth. That's why Isaiah's long-term survival fascinated doctors. Despite the severity of the condition, he adapted to communicate using technology and later gained attention online after collaborating on music projects where synthesized speech recreated lyrics using his words. And honestly, cases like this are a reminder of how fragile human development really is. The formation of the human face depends on millions of microscopic biological instructions unfolding perfectly before birth. When even a few of those instructions fail, the results can completely reshape a person's life in ways medicine still struggles to fully explain or repair. Story 30. Foreign accent syndrome sounds almost fictional, which is why cases like the woman from Ontario gained so much attention. After suffering a severe migraine, stroke, head injury, or other neurological event, depending on the specific case, some patients suddenly begin speaking with what sounds like a completely different accent, not because they learned a new language. Their speech patterns physically change. Listeners may suddenly hear what sounds like British, Eastern European, Australian, French, or other foreign accents, even though the person has never lived in those places. In reality, the patient is usually not truly speaking with a genuine regional accent. Instead, subtle neurological changes alter timing, rhythm, pronunciation, tongue placement, and vocal stress patterns enough that the brain interprets the speech as foreign. And honestly, that's what makes it so unsettling. Accents feel deeply tied to identity. Most people think of it as stable and personal, something built over a lifetime. Cases of foreign accent syndrome suggest that identity markers can potentially be altered almost overnight through tiny disruptions in the brain. Researchers believe the condition usually results from damage involving language and motor speech areas, particularly regions coordinating precise muscle movements required for speech production. But the syndrome remains extremely rare and still poorly understood. Some patients develop it after strokes or traumatic brain injuries, others after migraines, multiple sclerosis, or anesthesia. In rare situations, no obvious structural damage appears at all. The psychological effect can be devastating too. Many patients report feeling alienated from their own voices, while friends and family suddenly perceive them differently despite the person remaining mentally unchanged. It's one of those neurological conditions that reveals how fragile seemingly permanent aspects of personality and identity actually are, down to the very sound of your own voice. Story 31. Gabby Gingras from Big Lake grew up with a condition that sounds like a superpower until you realize how horrifying it actually is. Gabby was born with congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, an extremely rare neurological disorder that prevents the body from properly feeling pain. At first, her parents noticed strange things. She barely reacted to injuries. Needles didn't bother her. Burns, cuts, infections, broken bones, none of it produced the normal warning signals that keep humans alive. As a toddler, she would chew through her own lips and fingers without realizing she was severely injuring herself. That's the terrifying reality of not feeling pain. Pain seems awful, but biologically it's one of the body's most important survival systems. It teaches boundaries. It forces people to stop before damage becomes catastrophic. Without it, ordinary childhood becomes incredibly dangerous. Gabby reportedly scratched her eyes badly enough that doctors had to intervene to prevent blindness. She broke bones without noticing. Infections became serious before anyone realized something was wrong because her body never sounded the alarm. And researchers still find the condition fascinating because it reveals how pain actually works inside the nervous system. In many cases, mutations affecting genes like SCN9A disrupt the ability of pain-sensing nerves to transmit signals properly to the brain. Other senses may remain relatively normal, while pain itself essentially disappears. That's what makes the disorder so eerie medically. It demonstrates that pain is not simply suffering. It's a carefully engineered protective system built deep into human biology. Remove that system, and the world suddenly becomes far more dangerous than most people ever realize. Story 32. A woman in the United Kingdom became the subject of a disturbing medical case after developing a severe eye infection caused by cowpox, a rare relative of the far deadlier smallpox virus. The infection was reportedly traced back to her pet cat. That's what startled doctors so much. Most people think of cowpox as some ancient historical disease connected vaguely to vaccines and the eradication of smallpox. But the virus still exists naturally in certain animal populations, especially rodents, and domestic cats can occasionally become infected after hunting them. Humans can then catch the virus through scratches, bites, or close contact. In this woman's case, the infection spread to the eye, causing severe inflammation and damage that threatened her vision. Cowpox infections in humans are usually rare and often limited to localized skin lesions, But when the virus reaches sensitive tissue like the eye, the consequences can become much more serious. What makes cases like this so unsettling medically is how they expose hidden viral ecosystems people barely think about anymore. Even though smallpox itself was eradicated globally, related viruses within the orthopox virus family still circulate quietly in animals. Most of the time, they remain obscure and isolated, but occasionally one crosses into humans in bizarre ways. And because routine smallpox vaccination stopped decades ago after eradication, younger generations no longer carry the same cross-protective immunity older populations once had. That realization worries some virologists. Not because cowpox itself is likely to become apocalyptic, but because it demonstrates how animal viruses related to historically catastrophic diseases are still out there, evolving quietly in the background. Story 33. Martin Pistorius lived through one of the most horrifying neurological ordeals imaginable after spending years fully conscious while the world believed he was mentally gone. As a child in South Africa, Martin suddenly became seriously ill around the age of 12. His condition rapidly worsened. He lost the ability to speak, move normally, make eye contact, or respond meaningfully to people around him. Eventually, doctors and caregivers assumed he had lost awareness almost completely, but he hadn't. That's what makes the story so terrifying. Over time, Martin gradually regained full consciousness internally, while remaining almost entirely unable to communicate. He later described becoming aware of conversations around him, hearing people discuss him as though he were no longer mentally present, while he remained trapped inside a body that could not respond. For years, nobody realized he was cognitively aware. He described existing almost like a living statue, conscious but invisible. Researchers believe his condition may have involved a severe neurological illness combined with something resembling locked-in syndrome, though the exact diagnosis remains debated. What finally changed his life was when a caregiver noticed subtle signs that he might actually understand what was happening around him. Further evaluation eventually revealed that Martin's awareness had been present far longer than anyone suspected. He later learned to communicate using assistive computer technology and eventually rebuilt his life almost from scratch. And honestly, cases like his deeply unsettled neurologists and ethicists because they expose how difficult it can sometimes be to accurately measure consciousness itself. The human brain can remain aware even when the body becomes nearly incapable of showing it externally, which means there may be patients throughout medical history who heard everything around them while being unable to prove they were still there. Story 34, Natalie Adler became the subject of medical curiosity after developing episodes where she reportedly could not open her eyes for days at a time. The condition sounded almost impossible at first. Natalie described waking up unable to lift her eyelids despite remaining fully conscious and aware. During some episodes, her eyes stayed shut for extended periods, leaving her temporarily unable to see or function normally even though she was awake. Doctors initially struggled to determine whether the problem was neurological, muscular, autoimmune, or psychological. That's what made the case so unsettling. Opening your eyes feels automatic. Most people never think about it. But eyelid movement actually depends on a complicated interaction between muscles, cranial nerves, brain signaling pathways, and neuromuscular control systems working perfectly every second. A disruption anywhere in that chain can produce bizarre symptoms. Some researchers suspected conditions related to blepharospasm, or rare neuromuscular disorders affecting the muscles responsible for lifting the eyelids. Others considered functional neurological mechanisms where the nervous system malfunctions, without obvious structural damage appearing on scans. But no universally accepted explanation ever fully resolved the mystery publicly. And honestly, cases like this deeply unsettle neurologists because they expose how fragile seemingly simple bodily actions really are. Blinking, focusing, opening your eyes, moving your face, all of it relies on invisible neurological coordination so precise we usually never notice it happening at all, until something suddenly breaks. Story 35. Ashley Morris lives with a condition so bizarre that it sounds medically impossible at first. Contact with water causes her body to break out in painful reactions. Morris suffers from aquagenic urticaria, an extremely rare disorder often nicknamed water allergy. Whenever water touches her skin, whether from showers, rain, sweat, tears, or even high humidity, she can develop burning sensations, itching, hives, and painful rashes. And the terrifying part is that the reaction does not depend on the type of water: hot water, cold water, purified water, natural water. It can all trigger symptoms. That's what makes the condition so disturbing medically. Human beings are built around water. The body constantly sweats, produces tears, and relies on hydration to survive. So the idea that ordinary contact with water can trigger pain transforms basic daily activities into something stressful and exhausting. Researchers still do not fully understand what causes aquagenic urticaria. Technically, patients are probably not allergic to water molecules themselves, because the human body is mostly water already. Instead, scientists suspect water may interact with compounds on or within the skin, triggering abnormal immune responses that release histamines and inflammation. But no single explanation fully accounts for every case. And because the disorder is so rare, fewer than 100 confirmed cases worldwide, research data remains limited. Treatments like antihistamines, barrier creams, UV therapy, and specialized bathing methods help some patients partially, but there is still no universally effective cure. What makes the condition especially eerie is how invisible most people's relationship with water normally is. People touch water constantly without thinking. For someone like Ashley Morris, every shower, every drop of rain, every bead of sweat becomes something her body experiences almost like an attack. Story 36. Karen Keegan shocked doctors and geneticists after DNA testing appeared to show that she was not biologically related to two of her own sons. At first, the results looked impossible. Keegan underwent genetic testing while preparing for a kidney transplant, and the test suggested that her children's DNA did not match hers the way doctors expected. In fact, the results initially resembled what you would expect from an aunt rather than a biological mother. Naturally, physicians suspected a mistake, but repeated testing kept producing the same bizarre outcome. Eventually, researchers uncovered one of the strangest explanations in modern genetics. Karen Keegan was likely a human chimera. A human chimera occurs when two embryos fuse together very early during development in the womb. Instead of developing into twins, the embryos merge into a single person carrying two genetically distinct cell populations inside the same body. Essentially, one person can contain two different genomes. In Keegan's case, some parts of her body carried one DNA profile, while other tissues carried another. The DNA found in her blood did not perfectly match the DNA passed to some of her children because her reproductive tissues likely originated from the second genetic line. That's what made the case so disturbing scientifically. Most people think of DNA as a fixed biological fingerprint that defines identity with certainty. Cases like Keegan's reveal that human genetics can sometimes become far messier than people realize. One person can literally contain multiple genetic identities at once. The discovery forced scientists and legal experts to rethink assumptions about maternity testing, forensic evidence, transplantation, and even personal identity itself. Because under rare circumstances, your own DNA may not fully prove who you are biologically. Story 37. Joey DeGrandis possesses a condition that fascinates neuroscientists because his memory works in a way that almost seems incompatible with how normal human forgetting operates. DeGrandis has highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM, an extremely rare condition where people can recall enormous amounts of autobiographical information with astonishing precision. Give him a random date from years earlier, and he can often tell you exactly what day of the week it was, what he was doing, conversations he had, news events that happened, what the weather was like, and countless other details most people's brains would have discarded long ago. And the memories are not vague impressions. They often replay with vivid clarity. That's what unsettles researchers so much about HSAM. Human memory is normally selective and imperfect. The brain constantly edits, compresses, distorts, and deletes information, because storing everything in perfect detail would probably become psychologically overwhelming. But people with HSAM seem unable to forget autobiographical experiences the way most humans do. Brain imaging studies suggest differences in regions tied to memory formation, obsessive thought patterns, and emotional processing. But scientists still do not fully understand why certain individuals develop this ability. And honestly, the condition is not always a gift. Many people with HSAM describe reliving painful memories intensely years later, as though the events happened recently. Embarrassment, grief, fear, arguments, loss. The emotional impact often remains unusually vivid because the memories never truly fade into the background. That may be the strangest realization these cases produce. Forgetting is not simply a flaw in human memory. It may actually be one of the brain's most important protective functions. Story 38. Foreign accent syndrome first gained widespread attention during World War II after the bizarre case of a Norwegian woman whose speech changed dramatically following a brain injury. The woman, Astrid L., was reportedly struck in the head by shrapnel during a German air raid in Norway in 1941. She survived the injury, but afterward, something deeply strange happened. Her speech patterns changed so drastically that people around her believed she sounded German. And during wartime Norway, that was a serious problem. Locals reportedly treated her with suspicion and hostility because they assumed she was sympathetic to the occupying German forces. But neurologists later realized the accent change was not deliberate at all. It was the result of neurological damage. Researchers eventually classified cases like hers under foreign accent syndrome, an extraordinarily rare condition where strokes, head trauma, migraines, or other neurological disruptions alter speech rhythm, pronunciation, timing, and intonation enough that listeners perceive the voice as foreign. The person does not actually learn a new accent consciously. Instead, tiny changes in muscle coordination and speech processing create patterns the brain interprets as belonging to another language group. And honestly, that's what makes the disorder so unsettling. Accents feel deeply tied to identity, nationality, and personality. Most people think of their voice as something stable and fundamentally them. Cases like Astrid's show that a small injury to the brain can unexpectedly rewrite that identity marker almost overnight. The fact that neurological damage could accidentally make someone sound like the enemy during wartime only made the case even more haunting historically. Story 39. Wim Hof became famous because his body appears capable of tolerating cold in ways that seem almost impossible for a normal human being. Nicknamed the Iceman, Hof has performed stunts that sound medically reckless, sitting buried in ice for hours, climbing snowy mountains nearly unclothed, swimming beneath frozen lakes, and running marathons in extreme cold with minimal clothing. And somehow, he often emerges without suffering the kind of hypothermia doctors would normally expect. That's what fascinated researchers. For years, scientists assumed the autonomic nervous system, the systems controlling body temperature, immune responses, heart rate, and stress reactions, operated largely beyond conscious control. But studies on Hof suggested he might be able to influence some of those systems voluntarily through breathing techniques, meditation, and gradual cold exposure training. In laboratory experiments, researchers observed unusual responses involving adrenaline release, immune activity, and temperature regulation while Hof practiced his methods. And honestly, the implications were unsettling. Because if some people can consciously alter physiological systems once believed automatic, then human biology may be more adaptable than researchers previously assumed. That said, scientists still debate how much of Hof's ability comes from genetics versus training. Some evidence suggests he may possess naturally unusual cold tolerance combined with years of conditioning that amplified those traits dramatically. His breathing methods can also create altered physiological states involving oxygen, carbon dioxide, and stress response systems. But researchers strongly warn people not to imitate his feats recklessly. Cold exposure can become deadly extremely quickly, and several accidental deaths have been linked to people attempting breath-holding exercises associated with Hof's techniques underwater. Still, his case remains fascinating because it challenges assumptions about the limits of human adaptation. Most people think of body temperature regulation as fixed and automatic. Wim Hof demonstrated that under certain conditions, humans may possess far more influence over those survival systems than science once believed.